Sarah Martinez had been serving coffee and peanuts at 30,000 feet for what seemed like a lifetime. To the passengers on Flight 447, she was just another friendly face in the blue uniform of Atlantic Airways. They saw her warm smile as she handed out blankets, her patient voice when dealing with crying babies, and her quick movements up and down the narrow aisles. What they didn't see was the specially trained federal agent underneath the flight attendant exterior. Sarah had spent 5 years perfecting this cover. She had attended flight attendant school just like any other candidate, learned every safety procedure, memorized the locations of every emergency exit, and practiced the art of keeping passengers calm during turbulence. But unlike her colleagues, Sarah had also spent months at the Federal Air Marshal training facility in New Mexico, learning combat techniques, weapons handling, and how to neutralize threats in the confined space of an aircraft. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at Newark International Airport at 5 in the morning, her rolling suitcase clicking behind her as she made her way through the employee entrance. She checked in with the crew scheduling office, picked up her flight assignments, and headed to the briefing room where Captain Williams was reviewing the weather conditions for their route to Los Angeles. "Looks like smooth sailing today. Folks," Captain Williams announced to the crew of 6, "we've got a full load, 230 passengers. Standard service, nothing unusual on the manifest." Sarah nodded along with the others, but she had already reviewed the passenger list the night before. Her real supervisor at the Federal Air Marshal Service had flagged 3 names that required extra attention, though none were considered high-risk threats. As the crew made their way to the aircraft, Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She mentally mapped every inch of the Boeing 767, noting the positions of the emergency equipment, the locations of potential weapons that could be fashioned from ordinary items, and the sight lines from her assigned station in the main cabin. To anyone watching, she appeared to be going through the same routine as her fellow flight attendants, but her eyes were taking in details that could mean the difference between life and death. The passengers began boarding at 7:30. Sarah stationed herself at door 2L, greeting each person with a practiced smile while simultaneously conducting a threat assessment. The businessman in seat 4A seemed nervous, checking his watch repeatedly. The college student in 12F kept looking around anxiously. The elderly woman in 18C was traveling alone, but carried herself with an alertness that seemed unusual for her age. Sarah filed away each observation while maintaining her cheerful demeanor. "Welcome aboard," she said to a man in his 30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He mumbled a response and moved quickly down the aisle without making eye contact. Something about his behavior triggered Sarah's instincts, but she couldn't put her finger on what exactly bothered her. His seat was in the back of the aircraft, which would make observation difficult during the flight. As the final passenger settled in, Sarah went through her pre-flight safety demonstration with mechanical precision. She had performed this routine thousands of times, but today something felt different. The nervous energy in the cabin seemed higher than usual. Several passengers were fidgeting more than normal, and she noticed at least 3 people who avoided looking at the safety demonstration entirely. Captain Williams' voice crackled over the intercom as they pushed back from the gate. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Sarah secured the galley and took her seat, but her mind remained active. During her years of service, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was wrong. The feeling was subtle, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, but it was there. The takeoff was smooth, and within 30 minutes they had reached their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. Sarah began the beverage service, working her way methodically through the cabin. She made a point of observing the passengers she had flagged earlier. The businessman in 4A had relaxed somewhat and was reading a magazine. The college student was listening to music with his eyes closed, but the man in the dark jacket remained alert, his eyes constantly scanning the cabin. "Coffee or tea?" Sarah asked when she reached his row. He looked up at her for the first time, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. There was an intensity there, a focus that didn't match his casual appearance. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undertone of tension. "Just water," he said, then added quietly, "You have kind eyes. I hope you remember that." The comment was strange enough to stick in Sarah's mind as she continued down the aisle. In her experience, passengers who made personal comments to flight attendants were either flirting or building up to a complaint. This felt like neither. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah was in the forward galley preparing lunch service when she heard a commotion from the main cabin. Raised voices, the sound of someone standing up abruptly, and then a woman's scream cut through the normal hum of the aircraft engines. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She pressed the call button to alert the cockpit while moving toward the cabin, her hand instinctively checking for the defensive weapons concealed in her uniform. What she saw when she entered the main cabin would forever change the lives of everyone aboard Flight 47. 3 men had simultaneously stood up in different sections of the aircraft. They were coordinating their movements with military precision, and each one held what appeared to be a weapon. The man in the dark jacket was no longer trying to blend in. His casual demeanor had been replaced by the cold efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. "Nobody move," his voice carried clearly through the cabin. "This aircraft is now under our control." The passengers froze in terror, some beginning to sob quietly. The other flight attendants looked toward Sarah for guidance, unaware that their colleague was the only person on board trained and equipped to handle this exact situation. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, her years of preparation taking over. She had studied hijacking scenarios extensively, practiced responses in simulators, and mentally rehearsed this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of facing armed terrorists while surrounded by 200 innocent people trapped in a metal tube, 7 miles above the Earth. The next few minutes would determine whether Flight 447 became another tragedy in aviation history or a testament to the skill and courage of an undercover air marshal whose true identity was about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. The transformation happened in seconds. Sarah's mind shifted from flight attendant mode to federal agent, every sense becoming hyper-aware of the deadly situation unfolding around her. She counted 3 hijackers, positioned strategically throughout the cabin to control different sections of the aircraft. The man in the dark jacket, who she now recognized as the leader, stood near the middle of the plane where he could see both the front and back sections. "Everyone remain seated and keep your hands visible," the leader commanded. His voice was steady and controlled, suggesting this was not his first terrorist operation. Sarah noticed he spoke with a slight accent, possibly Middle Eastern, but his English was perfect. The weapon in his hand appeared to be a ceramic knife, designed to pass through airport security undetected. The second hijacker, a younger man with a nervous energy, had taken position near the emergency exits over the wings. He kept glancing at his watch and mumbling under his breath. Sarah recognized the signs of someone operating on adrenaline and fear, which made him potentially more dangerous than his calm leader. Nervous people made mistakes, and mistakes in the confined space of an aircraft often meant innocent people got hurt. The third terrorist was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had seen violence before. He controlled the rear section of the cabin, his movements deliberate and professional. Unlike his younger companion, this man showed no signs of nervousness. He stood with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this before. Sarah's fellow flight attendants, Jennifer and Mark, stood frozen in the aisles. Jennifer was visibly shaking, her face pale with terror. Mark looked like he was considering doing something heroic and stupid. Sarah caught his eye and gave him the slightest shake of her head. The last thing she needed was a well-meaning colleague complicating an already impossible situation. "Where is the Federal Air Marshal?" the leader suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. Several passengers gasped. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Did they know about her, or were they fishing for information? "We know there is one aboard this flight. Identify yourself immediately or passengers will die." The cabin fell into complete silence except for the steady hum of the engines and the quiet sobbing of a child somewhere in the back. Sarah's mind raced through her options. If they somehow knew about an air marshal on board, her cover might already be blown. But revealing herself now would eliminate any element of surprise she might have. "I said identify yourself," the leader shouted, his controlled demeanor cracking slightly. He grabbed the arm of a businessman in the aisle seat and pressed the ceramic blade against his throat. The man's eyes went wide with terror, and several passengers screamed. Sarah made her decision. She stepped forward, her hands raised but her voice steady. "I'm just a flight attendant," she said, playing her role perfectly. "Please don't hurt anyone. We want to cooperate with you." The leader studied her for a moment, his eyes searching her face for signs of deception. "You," he pointed at Jennifer. "Go to the cockpit. Tell the pilots they are to follow our instructions exactly, or passengers will die. Jennifer nodded frantically and stumbled toward the front of the aircraft. Sarah watched her go, knowing that the cockpit crew was her primary responsibility to protect. If the terrorists gained control of the flight deck, the situation would become exponentially more dangerous. While the leader was focused on Jennifer, Sarah used the distraction to assess her tactical situation. The ceramic knives were deadly but short-range weapons. The hijackers had positioned themselves well, but their positions also created blind spots she could potentially exploit. The aircraft's layout worked against her in some ways but provided opportunities in others. The nervous hijacker near the emergency exits was beginning to pace, his agitation increasing by the minute. Sarah recognized the signs of someone whose nerve was failing. In her training, she had learned that the most dangerous moment in any hijacking was when one of the perpetrators lost control. Desperate people did desperate things. "Ahmed, stay in position," the leader commanded in English, confirming Sarah's suspicion that they wanted the passengers to understand their communications. This suggested they were more interested in creating fear than maintaining operational security. The information could be useful if she survived to share it. The older hijacker in the back hadn't spoken yet, but Sarah noticed he was watching the passengers with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating threats. When his eyes met hers, she saw intelligence there and possibly suspicion. This man was dangerous in a different way than his companions. Where the leader was driven by ideology and the younger man by fear, this one was motivated by pure professionalism. Jennifer returned from the cockpit, tears streaming down her face. "They want to know your demands," she whispered to the leader. "The captain is asking what you want." The hijacker smiled coldly and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. That smile told her everything she needed to know about their intentions. "Tell him we want to change course," the leader said loudly, ensuring everyone in the cabin could hear. "We are going to New York. We have a message to deliver to the American people." The mention of New York sent waves of panic through the passengers. Everyone knew what had happened in New York before, and the implications were terrifying. Sarah's training had covered this exact scenario. Hijackers who wanted to use an aircraft as a weapon rarely planned to survive the mission. This meant traditional negotiation tactics were useless. They couldn't be reasoned with or bargained with because they weren't planning to escape. The only way to stop them was through force. But taking action against 3 armed men in a pressurized cabin filled with innocent people required perfect timing and execution. One mistake could result in explosive decompression, loss of aircraft control, or a massacre of passengers. Sarah had trained for years to handle exactly this situation, but the reality was more complex than any simulation. The aircraft began to bank left as Captain Williams complied with the hijackers' demands. Sarah felt the change in direction through her feet and knew they were now flying toward one of the most populated areas in the world. Time was becoming her enemy. Every minute that passed brought them closer to their destination and reduced her options for intervention. "You," the leader suddenly pointed at Mark. "Collect all cell phones and electronic devices. Anyone who tries to hide their phone will watch someone die." Mark began moving through the cabin with a bag, his hands shaking as passengers reluctantly surrendered their devices. Sarah watched the process while mentally cataloging every potential weapon within reach. The situation was evolving rapidly, and Sarah knew she would soon have to make the most important decision of her career. Continue playing her role as a helpless flight attendant, or reveal her true identity and risk everything on a desperate gamble to save 200 lives. As the aircraft continued its turn toward New York, she realized the choice might soon be made for her. 20 minutes after the hijacking began, Sarah watched as the nervous terrorist named Ahmed continued to deteriorate. His pacing had become more erratic and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. She recognized the classic signs of someone whose psychological preparation was crumbling under the reality of the situation. In her experience, this was often when hijackings went from bad to catastrophic. The leader seemed to notice his companion's distress as well. He barked something in Arabic that Sarah didn't understand, but Ahmed's response was in English and loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can't do this, Hassan. These are innocent people, children." His voice cracked on the last word, and Sarah saw several passengers look toward him with a mixture of hope and terror. Hassan's face darkened with rage. "You knew what this mission required," he hissed. Do not shame yourself and our cause now. The exchange confirmed Sarah's worst fears about their intentions. This wasn't a hijacking for ransom or political prisoner releases. These men planned to use Flight 447 as a weapon, and Ahmed's crisis of conscience was threatening their timeline. The older hijacker in the back, who the others had called Khalil, finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured, but carried an authority that even Hassan seemed to respect. Ahmed, remember your family. Remember why we are here. The words had an immediate effect on the younger man, who stopped pacing and took several deep breaths, but Sarah could see the internal battle continuing behind his eyes. She knew this was her best opportunity. Ahmed's doubt created a potential weakness she could exploit, but only if she acted quickly and decisively. The problem was positioning. She was currently in the forward galley area, which gave her access to potential weapons but put her at a tactical disadvantage. She needed to get closer to Ahmed without arousing suspicion. Please, Sarah said to Hassan, her voice deliberately shaky to maintain her cover as a frightened flight attendant. Some of the passengers are getting sick from fear. Can I get them some water? It was a reasonable request that would allow her to move through the cabin and get closer to Ahmed's position. Hassan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Move slowly. Any sudden movements and people die. Sarah began walking down the aisle, her hands visible and movements deliberate. As she passed each row, she made mental notes of passenger positions and potential obstacles. The businessman who had been threatened earlier caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you," clearly thinking she was risking herself to help others. When she reached Ahmed's section, Sarah could see the full extent of his psychological breakdown. His hands were shaking and he kept wiping sweat from his face. The ceramic knife in his grip looked less steady than it had 20 minutes earlier. She realized that in his current state he might be more dangerous than his calmer companions, not less. "Water?" she asked a middle-aged woman in the window seat, speaking loudly enough for Ahmed to hear. As she leaned over to hand the woman a small bottle, Sarah positioned herself to study Ahmed's exact location and the spacing between him and the nearest passengers. The emergency exit was directly behind him, and she noticed his free hand kept drifting toward the handle. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Ahmed wasn't just having second thoughts about the mission. He was contemplating opening the emergency exit. At their current altitude, such an action would cause explosive decompression that would kill everyone aboard within minutes. His psychological breakdown wasn't making him less dangerous. It was making him unpredictably lethal. Sarah continued her water distribution while her mind raced through options. She was now within striking distance of Ahmed, but any action she took would immediately expose her true identity to Hassan and Khalil. Once her cover was blown, she would lose any element of surprise for dealing with the other two hijackers. But if Ahmed opened that emergency exit, there wouldn't be anyone left to save. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they hit a patch of turbulence, and Ahmed's grip on the exit handle tightened. Sarah saw his knuckles go white and knew she was out of time. She had trained for this exact scenario dozens of times, but the reality of having to act was paralyzing. In the next few seconds, she would either save 200 lives or get everyone killed. "Ahmed," she said quietly, moving closer to him, "you don't want to do this." Her voice was no longer that of a frightened flight attendant. It carried the authority and confidence of someone trained to handle crisis situations. Ahmed looked at her with surprise, perhaps hearing something in her tone that didn't match her appearance. "You don't understand," he whispered back. "If I don't follow through, they will kill my sister. But if I do this, all these people die. I cannot live with either choice." The confession confirmed Sarah's assessment of the situation. Ahmed had been coerced into participating, probably through threats to his family. This gave her a psychological lever to work with. "There's a third choice," Sarah said, stepping even closer. She could see Hassan beginning to notice their conversation from the middle of the cabin. "You can help me stop this." Ahmed's eyes widened as he processed what she was implying. For a moment, hope flickered across his face, but then fear took over again. "You are just a flight attendant," he said, but there was a question in his voice. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached slowly into her uniform pocket and withdrew her federal credentials, keeping them low so only Ahmed could see them. His reaction was immediate and dramatic. "Federal Air Marshal," Sarah whispered. "I can protect your sister, but I need your help right now." Ahmed stared at the badge, his mind clearly struggling to process this development. Hassan had noticed their extended conversation and was beginning to move in their direction, his face showing suspicion and growing anger. Ahmed looked back and forth between Sarah and Hassan, the weight of his decision visible on his face. In that moment, the fate of Flight 447 hung on the choice of a scared young man who had never wanted to be a terrorist. Sarah could see Hassan getting closer, and she knew that in seconds her cover would be blown regardless of Ahmed's decision. The turbulence hit again, stronger this time, and the aircraft lurched. Several passengers gasped, and for a moment everyone's attention was focused on maintaining their balance. Sarah realized this might be her only chance to act before Hassan reached them. She looked directly into Ahmed's eyes, hoping to see some sign of what he had decided. Time seemed to slow as Sarah prepared to either gain an unexpected ally or fight for her life against 3 armed terrorists in a confined space 7 miles above the Earth. The next 30 seconds would determine whether Flight 447 became a weapon of mass destruction or a testament to the power of conscience and courage in the face of impossible odds. Ahmed's decision came without words. As Hassan approached their position with growing suspicion, the young terrorist slowly shifted his grip on the ceramic knife and gave Sarah the slightest nod. In that instant, she knew she had gained an ally, but she also knew they now faced an even more dangerous situation. Hassan and Khalil would not hesitate to kill Ahmed the moment they realized he had switched sides. "What are you two discussing?" Hassan demanded, now only a few feet away. His own weapon was raised, and Sarah could see the cold calculation in his eyes. This was a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. Ahmed's face went pale, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "She was just giving water to passengers," Ahmed replied. "Some of them are becoming sick from fear." Hassan's gaze moved between them, clearly sensing something was wrong but unable to identify exactly what. Sarah maintained her frightened flight attendant persona, but her body was coiled and ready for action. That's when Khalil's voice cut through the tension from the back of the cabin. "Hassan, we have a problem. The cockpit is not responding to our last instruction." The distraction was exactly what Sarah needed. As Hassan turned to look toward his older companion, she struck. Her years of training compressed into 3 seconds of explosive action. Sarah's hand shot out and grabbed Ahmed's wrist, guiding his knife toward Hassan while simultaneously driving her knee into the hijacker leader's solar plexus. The impact doubled Hassan over, and Ahmed's blade, guided by Sarah's grip, sliced across the terrorist's forearm, causing him to drop his own weapon. The passengers erupted in screams as the true nature of the situation became clear. Children were crying, adults were shouting, and the organized calm that Hassan had maintained through fear was instantly shattered. Sarah kicked Hassan's dropped knife under the seats where no one could reach it, then spun to face Khalil, who was already moving forward from the rear of the cabin. "Everyone stay down," Sarah shouted, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "I am a federal air marshal." The announcement sent shockwaves through the cabin. Some passengers looked confused, others relieved, but most were simply terrified by the violence erupting around them. Khalil moved with the fluid grace of a professional, weaving between the seats as passengers scrambled to get out of his way. Sarah could see immediately that he was the most dangerous of the 3 hijackers. Unlike Hassan's ideological fervor or Ahmed's reluctant participation, Khalil was motivated by pure professional competence. He had been doing this longer than the others, and it showed in every movement. Ahmed stood frozen, still processing the rapid change in circumstances. "Get his knife," Sarah ordered, pointing to Hassan, who was still doubled over but beginning to recover. Ahmed hesitated for a crucial second, the lifetime of conditioning and fear warring with his newfound resolve to do the right thing. Sarah couldn't wait for Ahmed to overcome his paralysis. Khalil was now only 20 feet away, moving steadily forward with his ceramic blade held low and ready. She grabbed a metal coffee pot from the galley service cart and hurled it at the advancing terrorist. Khalil deflected it easily, but the action bought her precious seconds to position herself better. "The cockpit," Hassan gasped, finally finding his voice. "Khalil, secure the cockpit! The mission continues!" Even wounded and disarmed, the hijacker leader remained focused on their objective. Sarah realized with growing horror that even if she managed to defeat all 3 terrorists, they might have already communicated instructions to accomplices on the ground or in the cockpit itself. Khalil ignored Hassan's command and continued his methodical advance toward Sarah. She could see in his eyes that he had identified her as the primary threat and was adapting his tactics accordingly. This wasn't just about completing their mission anymore. This was about professional survival against a worthy opponent. "Ahmed, the cockpit," Sarah barked while keeping her eyes on Khalil. "Get to the cockpit and tell them what's happening." Ahmed finally snapped out of his paralysis and began moving toward the front of the aircraft, but Hassan managed to grab his ankle as he passed. The hijacker leader might have been wounded, but he wasn't finished fighting. The collision between Ahmed and Hassan sent both men tumbling into the aisle. Passengers scrambled to get out of the way, climbing over seats and each other in their panic. The narrow confines of the aircraft cabin, which Sarah had always seen as a tactical disadvantage, were now working against everyone as people struggled to escape the expanding zone of violence. Khalil used the distraction to close the distance between himself and Sarah. She grabbed a wine bottle from the galley cart and swung it at his head, but he ducked smoothly and came up with his knife aimed at her midsection. Only her reflexes, honed by years of training, allowed her to twist away in time. The blade sliced through her uniform but missed her skin by inches. "You are good," Khalil said calmly, speaking for the first time since the fight began. "But this aircraft is going to complete its mission whether you live or die." His words chilled Sarah more than the near miss with his knife. They suggested a level of planning and backup systems that went far beyond the three men she was fighting. The aircraft suddenly lurched hard to the left, throwing everyone off balance. Sarah realized that either the pilots were trying to help by creating turbulence, or something had gone wrong in the cockpit. The violent maneuver sent Khalil stumbling backward, and Sarah seized the opportunity to press her attack. She drove forward with the broken wine bottle, aiming for his knife hand. Khalil managed to deflect her thrust, but the jagged glass opened a deep cut across his palm, forcing him to switch the blade to his other hand. The change in his grip gave Sarah a momentary advantage, and she pressed it ruthlessly. Her next strike was aimed at his throat, but Khalil proved why he was a professional. Despite the pain from his wounded hand and the continuing turbulence from the aircraft's erratic movements, he managed to step inside her attack and drive his elbow toward her ribs. Sarah twisted away, but the blow still connected with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Behind them, Ahmed and Hassan continued their struggle on the floor of the aisle. Ahmed might have had moral authority on his side, but Hassan had years of combat experience and the desperate strength of a fanatic whose mission was failing. The young man was clearly losing the fight, and Sarah knew she couldn't count on his help much longer. The realization hit her that despite her training, her years of preparation and her tactical advantages, she might not be able to stop all three hijackers in time. The aircraft was still flying toward New York, and every minute that passed brought them closer to whatever target they had selected. Even if she won this fight, the mission might continue without them. As Khalil regrouped for his next attack and Hassan began to gain the upper hand against Ahmed, Sarah made a desperate decision. She would have to abandon her careful tactics and risk everything on a single, all-or-nothing gambit that would either end the hijacking or get everyone aboard killed in the attempt. Sarah's desperate gambit began with a calculated risk that went against every instinct she had developed during her years of training. Instead of maintaining her defensive position against Khalil, she suddenly turned and ran toward the front of the aircraft, deliberately exposing her back to the most dangerous hijacker. The move was so unexpected that even Khalil hesitated for a crucial second before pursuing her. "She's going for the cockpit," Hassan screamed from the floor where he continued to grapple with Ahmed. "Stop her!" But Sarah's real target wasn't the cockpit door. As she ran past the first-class section, she grabbed the emergency axe from its mounted case near the front galley. The tool was designed for rescue operations, but in her hands it became something far more formidable. Khalil was fast, but Sarah's head start and her knowledge of the aircraft's layout gave her the advantage she needed. When he rounded the corner into the front galley area, she was waiting for him. The fire axe whistled through the air in a horizontal arc that would have taken his head off if he hadn't thrown himself backward. At the last possible moment, the blade of the axe buried itself in the galley wall with a solid thunk, and for a moment Sarah struggled to pull it free. Khalil used her momentary disadvantage to lunge forward with his ceramic knife, but the confined space of the galley worked against him now. His strike was too cramped to be effective, and Sarah managed to block it with the axe handle while driving her knee toward his midsection. The impact sent Khalil stumbling backward into the passenger cabin, where terrified travelers pressed themselves against the windows and seatbacks. Trying to become invisible, Sarah followed him, the fire axe now free and ready for another strike. But as she emerged from the galley, she saw that the situation had deteriorated even further. Ahmed was on his back in the aisle, Hassan's hands around his throat. The young terrorist who had tried to do the right thing was losing consciousness, his face turning blue as Hassan squeezed the life out of him. Even more alarming, several passengers had decided to join the fight. A businessman was hitting Hassan with a laptop computer while a college-age woman tried to pull his hands away from Ahmed's throat. "Get back," Sarah shouted at the would-be rescuers. "I've got this." But her moment of distraction cost her dearly. Khalil had used the time to grab a heavy briefcase from an overhead compartment, and he swung it at Sarah's head with devastating force. She managed to get the axe handle up to block the blow, but the impact sent shockwaves through her arms and nearly knocked the weapon from her grip. The aircraft chose that moment to lurch violently again, and this time Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of the landing gear extending. They were beginning their descent toward New York, which meant they were running out of time and altitude. Whatever the hijackers had planned, it was about to happen whether she stopped them or not. Khalil pressed his attack using the briefcase as both weapon and shield. He swung it at Sarah's ribs while simultaneously thrusting with his knife hand. Sarah managed to block the briefcase with her axe, but the knife blade sliced across her shoulder, drawing blood and sending fire through her arm. She gritted her teeth against the pain and swung the axe in a devastating counterstrike. The axe blade caught the briefcase squarely and split it open, sending papers and electronic equipment flying throughout the cabin. Among the scattered contents, Sarah glimpsed what looked like a sophisticated GPS device and several cell phones. Her blood ran cold as she realized these weren't just the tools of hijackers. They were the components of a guidance system designed to ensure the aircraft hit its target with precision. "You understand now?" Khalil said, breathing heavily but still dangerous. "Even if you kill all of us, the aircraft will complete its mission. We are not the only players in this game." His revelation confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This hijacking was just one part of a larger operation, and eliminating the hijackers might not be enough to save the aircraft or its intended target. Behind them, Hassan had released his grip on Ahmed's throat and was now struggling with the passengers who had come to the young man's aid. Ahmed was gasping for air but alive, and Sarah could see him trying to get back into the fight. The businessman with the laptop had managed to knock Hassan off balance, but the hijacker leader was reaching for something in his jacket pocket. Sarah's training had covered scenarios involving multiple attackers and complex terrorist operations, but the reality was more chaotic and desperate than any simulation. She was bleeding from her shoulder wound, facing a professional killer who showed no signs of fatigue, while a ticking clock counted down to whatever catastrophe awaited them in New York. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as someone began attacking the cockpit door. Sarah realized with growing alarm that there might be accomplices among the passengers or that the hijackers had backup plans she hadn't considered. Every assumption she had made about the situation was proving inadequate. Khalil lunged forward again, this time abandoning his knife in favor of trying to grab the fire axe. His hands closed around the handle just below Sarah's grip, and suddenly they were locked in a deadly struggle for control of the weapon. The axe blade wavered between them as each fighter tried to direct it toward their opponent. "The device is armed," Khalil hissed through gritted teeth. "Even if you win, everyone dies." Sarah didn't know if he was bluffing or telling the truth, but she couldn't afford to find out. With a surge of adrenaline born from desperation, she brought her knee up hard into Khalil's solar plexus while simultaneously twisting the axe handle. The combined attack broke his grip on the weapon and sent him staggering backward. Sarah raised the axe for what she hoped would be a finishing blow, but movement in her peripheral vision made her turn. Ahmed had recovered enough to rejoin the fight, but he wasn't moving toward Hassan as she had expected. Instead, he was heading for the scattered electronics from Khalil's briefcase. "The guidance system," Ahmed shouted. "I know how to disable it." Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but that hope was immediately crushed as Hassan produced a pistol from his jacket pocket. Somehow, impossibly, one of the hijackers had managed to smuggle a firearm aboard the aircraft. The sight of the gun changed everything. In the confined space of the aircraft cabin, a firearm was the ultimate force multiplier. No amount of hand-to-hand combat training could overcome the tactical advantage it provided. Sarah found herself facing the possibility that despite her courage, her training, and her desperate efforts, Flight 447 might still complete its deadly mission. The next few seconds would determine whether her gambit had been brilliant or suicidal. As the sound of Hassan's gun being cocked echoed through the cabin like a death knell, the appearance of Hassan's pistol created a moment of absolute silence in the cabin. Every passenger froze. Even the crying children seemed to sense the escalation in danger. Sarah felt time slow as her training automatically cataloged distances, angles, and potential cover. The gun was pointed directly at Ahmed, who was kneeling among the scattered electronics from Khalil's briefcase. "Step away from the equipment," Hassan commanded, his voice deadly calm despite the blood streaming from his wounded arm. "You have betrayed everything we worked for, Ahmed. Everything your sister will die for if you do not complete this mission." The mention of Ahmed's sister brought visible anguish to the young man's face. But he didn't move away from the electronics. Sarah realized this was her moment. Hassan's attention was focused entirely on Ahmed and the guidance system. Khalil, still recovering from her knee strike, was temporarily out of position. She had perhaps 3 seconds before Hassan's peripheral vision would detect her movement. The fire axe was still in her hands, but it was useless against a firearm at this range. Instead, Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She dropped the axe and raised her hands in apparent surrender. "Don't shoot him," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "He's just a kid who got in over his head. This isn't what he wanted." Hassan's eyes flicked toward her for just an instant, but that instant was what Ahmed needed. The young terrorist's fingers flew over the GPS device with surprising expertise. Sarah heard a series of electronic beeps, followed by a longer tone that seemed to indicate shutdown. Ahmed looked up with tears in his eyes and said, "It's done. The guidance system is disabled. We're flying blind now." Hassan's roar of rage was cut short by the sound of the cockpit door bursting open. Captain Williams emerged with what appeared to be a fire axe of his own, followed by his co-pilot carrying an emergency oxygen tank as a weapon. Sarah had never been so happy to see anyone in her entire life. "Drop the weapon," Captain Williams commanded. His voice carried the authority of someone who had been flying for 30 years and had never lost an aircraft. "This is my ship, and I will not allow you to harm my passengers or crew." Hassan swung the pistol toward the new threat, but this gave Sarah the opening she desperately needed. She dove toward the hijacker leader, no longer caring about her own safety. Her shoulder hit him in the midsection just as the gun discharged. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and Sarah felt the bullet pass close enough to her head that she could feel the heat. They crashed to the floor together, Hassan's finger still on the trigger as they struggled for control of the weapon. The gun fired twice more as they rolled across the narrow aisle. Passengers screamed and dove for cover, some trying to protect their children with their own bodies. Sarah could hear Khalil shouting something in Arabic, but she couldn't see him through the tangle of arms and legs as she fought Hassan for the pistol. Her training had included extensive firearms retention techniques, but Hassan was fighting with the desperation of a man whose entire mission was collapsing around him. His wounded arm was weaker than normal, but adrenaline was giving him strength beyond his injuries. Sarah managed to get both hands on the gun, but Hassan's finger was still inside the trigger guard. Captain Williams appeared above them, his fire axe raised and ready to strike. "I can't get a clear shot," he said to Sarah. "You're moving too much." Sarah understood his dilemma. One wrong move and he could kill her instead of Hassan. She needed to create an opening for him, but doing so would mean exposing herself to Hassan's gun. That's when Ahmed rejoined the fight. The young man who had started this ordeal as a reluctant terrorist threw himself onto Hassan's back, wrapping his arms around the hijacker leader's throat. "This ends now," Ahmed shouted. "No more innocent people die because of our choices." The additional weight was enough to tip the balance. Sarah felt Hassan's grip on the pistol weaken, and she managed to twist it away from both of them. The weapon skittered across the floor and came to rest under a row of seats, temporarily out of everyone's reach. But Hassan wasn't finished fighting. He drove his elbow backward into Ahmed's ribs with enough force to break bone. The young man gasped and loosened his grip, which allowed Hassan to roll away from Sarah and reach for his ceramic knife, which had fallen during their struggle. Sarah scrambled after him, but her wounded shoulder was beginning to affect her movement. Khalil chose that moment to launch his own desperate attack. He had recovered from Sarah's earlier strikes and now threw himself at Captain Williams, apparently deciding that controlling the cockpit was more important than helping Hassan. The two men crashed into the galley area, and Sarah heard the sounds of a fierce struggle. The cabin had become a battlefield. Passengers were pressed against the walls and windows, some trying to help but most simply trying to stay alive. The co-pilot was attempting to reach the gun under the seats while avoiding Hassan's wild swings with his knife. Ahmed was on his knees, clutching his ribs and gasping for breath. Sarah realized that despite all her training and preparation, the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Multiple fights were happening simultaneously. Weapons were scattered throughout the cabin, and the aircraft was still descending toward New York with its guidance system disabled, but its basic flight path unchanged. Sound of tearing metal echoed through the cabin as Khalil and Captain Williams's fight moved into the cockpit area. Sarah heard alarms beginning to sound, indicating that critical aircraft systems were being damaged in their struggle. Even if they managed to defeat all the hijackers, they might not have a flyable aircraft left when the fighting ended. Hassan lunged at her again with his knife, but this time, Sarah was ready. She sidestepped his attack and grabbed his wrist, using his own momentum to drive him face-first into the side of a passenger seat. The impact stunned him momentarily, and Sarah used the opportunity to look around for any advantage she could find. What she saw gave her hope. Several male passengers had overcome their fear and were moving to help. A man in a business suit was crawling toward the gun under the seats. Two college students were positioning themselves to block Khalil's escape from the cockpit area. An elderly woman was helping Ahmed to his feet, whispering encouragement in his ear. For the first time since the hijacking began, Sarah felt like they might actually win. But as Hassan shook off the effects of his collision with the seat and prepared for another attack, she realized that winning the fight and saving the aircraft might be two different things. The real battle was just beginning. The final confrontation began when the businessman successfully retrieved Hassan's pistol from under the seats. Instead of keeping it, he immediately slid it across the floor to Sarah, recognizing her as the federal agent leading the fight. The weapon felt familiar in her hands after years of training, and for the first time since the hijacking began, she felt like she had a decisive advantage. "It's over." "Hassan," Sarah said, pointing the gun at the hijacker leader, "surrender now and no one else has to die." But Hassan's response was a cold smile that chilled her to the bone. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small electronic device with a single red button. "The guidance system was not our only insurance," he said calmly. "This aircraft carries enough explosive material to level several city blocks. You may have won this battle, but the war continues. I press this button and everyone aboard dies along with thousands on the ground." The revelation sent waves of terror through the passengers who could hear his words. Sarah's mind raced through her options. If Hassan was telling the truth about explosives, shooting him might trigger a dead man's switch. But allowing him to live meant he could detonate the device whenever he chose. Her training had covered bomb threats, but this scenario was beyond anything she had practiced. From the cockpit area came the sound of Captain Williams finally gaining the upper hand over Khalil. "Got him," the pilot shouted. "Khalil is down." The news was encouraging, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the device in Hassan's hand. One terrorist defeated, but the most dangerous one still remained. Ahmed, despite his injuries, stumbled forward. "Hassan, please," he pleaded. "These people have done nothing wrong. Our fight is not with them." His words seemed to have some effect on the hijacker leader, who paused for a moment before responding. "Our fight is with everyone who supports the system that oppresses our people," Hassan replied. "These passengers, this aircraft, this entire country, they are all part of the machine that must be destroyed." His fanaticism was complete, Sarah realized. There would be no reasoning with him. That's when she noticed something that gave her hope. The device in Hassan's hand had a small LED light that was supposed to be green but was instead flashing red. Either the device was malfunctioning, or it wasn't armed properly. She decided to gamble everything on that observation. "Your device isn't working," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "Look at the indicator light. It's not armed." Hassan glanced down at the device, and in that moment of distraction Sarah acted, not with the gun, which might trigger an explosion, but with her own body. She launched herself at Hassan, driving her shoulder into his midsection while simultaneously grabbing for the detonator. They crashed to the floor again, but this time Sarah had the advantage of surprise and preparation. Her hands closed around the device just as Hassan's finger moved toward the button. The struggle for the detonator lasted only seconds, but to Sarah it felt like hours. She could feel Hassan's finger pressing against hers on the button, and she didn't know if the device would explode if activated or simply fail to function. The LED light continued to flash red as they rolled across the narrow aisle. Ahmed joined the struggle, ignoring his broken ribs to help Sarah wrestle the device away from Hassan. "I know about these devices," he gasped. "The red light means it's not receiving a signal from the explosive charges. They never armed the bombs properly." His words gave Sarah the strength she needed to make one final effort. With a surge of adrenaline, she twisted Hassan's wrist until she heard bones crack. He screamed and released his grip on the detonator, which Sarah immediately threw as far from them as possible. The device skittered down the aisle and came to rest near the rear of the cabin, its red light still blinking harmlessly. Hassan made one last desperate attempt to reach for Sarah's gun, but Ahmed was ready for him. The young man who had started this ordeal as a reluctant terrorist ended it by knocking Hassan unconscious with a solid punch to the jaw. The hijacker leader collapsed and didn't move again. Silence fell over the cabin except for the sound of people breathing heavily and children crying softly. Sarah looked around at the aftermath of the battle. Passengers were slowly emerging from behind seats and from the floor where they had taken cover. Captain Williams appeared from the cockpit, dragging an unconscious Khalil behind him. "How's the aircraft?" Sarah asked, suddenly remembering that their problems might not be over even with the hijackers defeated. Captain Williams managed a tired smile. "She's hurt but flyable. We're going to make an emergency landing at Newark. The control tower has been informed and emergency vehicles are standing by." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sarah used plastic restraints from her Marshal kit to secure all three hijackers. Although Hassan remained unconscious and Khalil was badly injured from his fight with the captain, Ahmed asked to be restrained as well, saying he wanted to face justice for his part in the hijacking, even though he had ultimately helped stop it. As they approached Newark for landing, Sarah made her way through the cabin, checking on passengers and trying to provide what comfort she could. The businessman who had retrieved the gun for her shook her hand and said, "I never would have guessed you were law enforcement. You played your part perfectly." A young mother with two small children stopped her near the front of the cabin. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my babies." Similar words followed from dozens of other passengers as the reality of what had almost happened began to sink in. The landing was rough but successful. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft as soon as it came to a stop, and FBI agents were the first ones aboard. Sarah identified herself and began the process of turning over her prisoners and providing her initial report of the incident. As the passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank her again or simply to touch her hand as they passed. Sarah realized that her cover as a flight attendant was permanently blown. But it didn't matter. She had done her job in the most dramatic way possible, and everyone aboard Flight 447 was alive because of it. Ahmed was the last of the hijackers to be taken away by federal agents. As they led him toward the exit, he stopped and looked back at Sarah. "Thank you for showing me there was another way," he said quietly. "My sister will be safe now because of your courage." Sarah nodded, understanding that sometimes redemption comes in the most unexpected forms. Months later, Sarah received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her actions aboard Flight 447. Ahmed testified against the terrorist cell that had threatened his family and was eventually released into witness protection. Hassan and Khalil were convicted of terrorism charges and sentenced to life in prison. Sarah returned to her duties as an air marshal, but her days of working undercover as a flight attendant were over. Her identity was too well known now. Instead, she became an instructor at the Federal Air Marshal Training Facility, teaching others how to handle the exact situation she had faced at 30,000 feet. Flight 447 became a symbol of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with impossible circumstances. But for Sarah Martinez, it was simply the day she proved that sometimes the best place to hide a guardian angel is behind a flight attendant's smile and a coffee pot.